Okay, so in part 3 of the Introduction to Sociology lecture this week, I'm going to sketch out and introduce the sociological imagination and also talk a little bit about about some other kind of sociological issues around public sociology and impact and stuff like that. So I suppose Soccer 101 is a course essentially to try and help instill a sociological imagination for you. And a way of thinking about this is through what Mills coined the way that kind of public issues must be revealed by relating them to personal troubles. So the think here is kind of public issues and problems and the way they infect individuals and vice versa. A vivid the relationship between private experience and to wider society. So to look at these tensions, and you can probably hear echoes of structure and agency in those sentences, Mills coined the idea of the sociological imagination, which I'll sketch out now. I suppose an example to get you thinking about this, though, would be, a person waiting for a surgery, on a waiting list. That, in essence, is a private trouble. It's a real issue for that individual person. But it's beyond that from a sociological point of view. It's links to more public, structural, institutional things going on. A lack of hospital beds, whether that particular ailment is treated seriously by some doctors, or whether the particular type of cancer has more funding in terms of its research or not, and the very possibility of it being operated on. If you die on a waiting list, it's a very personal problem, but really these things relate to more wider societal issues. So, things that we often render as being individual problems, such as unemployment, obesity, illiteracy, even things like, exposure to hazardous waste and where that kind of stuff gets dumped, and, who has to live close to those kind of things. The sociological imagination can help us, unpack what's going on there and to think about these kind of more individualized troubles and how they relate to these kind of wider institutions and structures and politics and funding and all these kind of things. So the imagination has 4 different factors, I suppose: the historical, the structural, the cultural, and the critical. The historical, just ask questions about how has the past influenced the present. The cultural thinks about how our different cultures, the way that we're socialized in different culture, has an impact on our lives. The structural, which I've gone on about quite a bit already, what roles do these social organizations and norms and things like that in institutions have on the way that we live our lives. And a more general one is this kind of critical mindset, critically kind of orienting towards these kind of things. Why is it this way? Really important sociological question is who benefits from the way things are at the moment? Who doesn't benefit? What alternatives exist? Now, it's important to say that at this point, don't get too carried away with trying to put things in these boxes of, historical or cultural, structural questions. They all interlink, but they just kind of ways of bringing up particular critical orientations towards things. So in a little bit more detail, what kind of sociological, historical factor questions can we ask? So things like, what can we learn from history about events or trends taking place today? How has the past influenced the present day way of thinking or acting? What experiences in people's histories cause them to act the way they do? Is there or are there legacies of historical justice that have an influence on the way people behave and practice today? So you can see there, I think that cartoon is a really good example of that kind of historical legacy, particularly in a country like Australia that's a settler colony that still has real problems in terms of race relations and who gets blamed for these problems. So we'll look at some of that stuff in much more detail in the weeks 3 and the weeks on race and ethnicity later in the course. I suppose more generally in terms of historical stuff, we can think about this in terms of the way science and technology influence our lives. The ad on the screen there is for asbestos that, in the early decades of the 20th century was invented by one kind of science as a really kind of cheap and useful thing to build houses out of. The truth of that thing changes over time as another form of science discovers that it actually gives you cancer. And then, there's all kind of powerful influences that try and cover this kind of stuff up. And workers continue to die, even though the company knows that it's giving people cancer. So, the historical truth of what asbestos is changes over time, and you can see there the tensions between the status quo and the way things change. So historical factors is one way of thinking sociologically. Cultural factors is essentially thinking about the norms and values and, almost the things we take for granted tend to be part of a particular culture. In Australia, for instance, we're kind of born into the things that are kind of normal in Australia, and these, will therefore almost set us up in a sensory way to feel different and maybe uncomfortable when we're outside of those things where we feel comfortable. The really easy way to think about this is foods, for instance. In Australia, we're kind of offended by eating things like whales. We wouldn't probably, for the most part, want to eat a dog, but in other countries this is much more normal. Yet we eat cows, which in other countries that's seen as offensive. You can see here in this one everyday act, eating particular animals in this sense, is kind of the norms, values and morals around those things are very different depending on different cultural traditions. That's to say whether we should be eating animals at all. So again, you can see how complex this can be. So essentially the cultural factors are looking at things like what influences do traditions have on our current social behaviour and interactions, what influence do shared cultural values have on the way that we act and think, and shared cultural values in terms of the way we maybe kind of struggle against other people or not like them, or get into arguments and how that works in terms of politics. What effect do particular cultural belief systems have on current social trends, and how and why do different cultures have different conceptions of what is normal. So this will be particularly interesting way of thinking about things when we think about gender, the nature-nurture debates that we'll look at a little bit in that week. When you kind of think about it, it's kind of absurd in a way that different colours are attached to different genders. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it too deeply. So cultural factors is a way of thinking about how those kind of traditions, things we take for granted, social norms, are actually social constructions, and therefore they can be different. Structural factors, I've gone on about these a lot already, and that is my favourite sociological GIF. Again, this is the way that kind of agency and structures come into tension. How do social organisations affect our lives? The different powerful discourses in society around education, law, politics, bureaucracies. These structures affect our lives. Increasingly, algorithms do, and we don't really know what's going on with those when we're playing around on our iPhones and how they're kind of pushing things in front of us. How do economic decisions shape our life choices? How do the things like gender, race, class, ethnicity, and things like age and religion affect our opportunities and choices? Importantly, too, we can think about how these varies over time and between countries and regions and between the urban, the rural and the regional and that kind of stuff. And again, the cultural factors will come into play there as well. And lastly, more generally, the critical factors. Given all these things I was just talking about, how could things be otherwise? Who's benefiting from things now? And who's suffering injustices or discrimination or marginalisation or suffering because of the way things are currently arranged? So what alternative futures are possible? What kinds of sociological critique can provide a starting point for social change? Importantly, a critical factor here is who gets to speak about a particular social problem, or from what point of view is kind of represented more than others. So what other voices need to be heard in relevant debates. Again, in the photos there, we can think here critically about something like capitalism, and the kind of well-worn saying that you hear in some left circles now about it seems to be easier to imagine the end of the world than it does to the end of capitalism as a way of organising society. And so we'll look in future weeks at the way that the likes of Marx and other critical theorists, what they have to say about that and why that's the case. The other photo there is what's known as the bum-proof bench in LA. And so I'm putting that there to think kind of, what kind of society sets up architecture in public space to, further punish and denigrate some of the most vulnerable peoples in society. what's going on where we kind of just walk past that kind of stuff. So critical factors here of asking us to orient ourselves towards things, see what social problems are there, think about how we can address them, and particularly from a humanistic standpoint, to think about inequalities and how we can help people, lower in the social system or those that are facing various forms of social deprivation. Okay, so to finish the lecture today, I'll just kind of quickly conclude with some wider thoughts. Throughout the course, you'll see a kind of huge diversity of different perspectives, different voices, and different concepts. So we, just like, or many other disciplines like psychology or philosophy or, politics, sociologists don't necessarily speak with one voice. It is across a large political spectrum, so it's neither inherently left or right. I would say in Australia, though, most sociologists tend to have a strong concern for social justice and redressing inequality. So, Australian sociology does tend to be dominated a little bit more by, say, the critical perspective than the more functional. In America, in particular, I would say it's a little bit more functional. But Mitchell will talk about that in future weeks in some detail as well. So, sociologists study all kinds of aspects of society, from, huge structural organisational things to everyday, forms of consumption or everyday practices. So there's a kind of macro, meso, micro thing going on, again, that we'll look at throughout the course. Just about anything you can think of, I think, has had some kind of sociological study happen to it or is going on at the moment. And as new things come up in society, sociologists tend to start bringing those into their studies or shining a sociological light on it as well. Importantly, which we'll look at in some detail in week 3, sociology itself these days, and rightly so, is kind of reckoning with its own discriminations, omissions and bias. Sociology itself has largely been dominated by the European and America in terms of its foundations and that kind of thing. It's been particularly male. And so today, there's a lot more kind of work going on to be more inclusive of other points of view within sociology itself. So as you can see, there's a certain irony there in sociology that something so critical of things like inequalities, but it can't be let off the hook itself in the sense that it's actually, like any discipline, been dominated by particular places and over the last couple of centuries. I suppose most importantly is sociological research always involves the use of data and evidence. So many of the theoretical claims and concepts that we'll be showing you throughout the course pretty much always relate back to some kind of empirical social study, and we'll be presenting you with a bunch of those as well. Now, one of the kind of debates that goes on within sociology is about how much impact it's having on the wider world. And these debates kind of come and go, but like many other academic disciplines, there's a concern about whether sociology runs the risks of not really connecting with everyday events and everyday people. This is particularly sometimes relates to the complexity of the way that sociology is written, and theories and the language around theory can be quite complex. Again, we'll look at the reasons why for that throughout the course. But more generally, there's been a kind of move over the past decade to encourage sociologists, in a sense, to kind of, do their academic empirical work, but then make an effort to have more influence on the public by, doing things in the media and being part of organisations as well, not just kind of studying them. So I'd say that this is happening, and is happening in Australia. And is happening with my colleagues here in Newcastle as well. So I've put a bunch of links to some conversation pieces and some radio spots there that you can check out. And the radio spots in particular around the group that I'm involved in, called the Newcastle Youth Studies Group. Okay, so to finish, sociology challenges individualistic and biological counts of social life. We're interested in the way that kind of our behaviours and the way that we relate to each other and we relate to institution and things is largely constructed around the way that societies are organised. These things aren't necessarily natural, and therefore they can be changed. So practicing sociology means considering the relevance of these kind of insights and hopefully adopting these kind of questioning stance in your own orientation towards the world. Why are things the way they are? Who benefits from these current arrangements? What alternatives exist to the status quo? It's important to note too that in the course we'll providing you with a really general introduction to what sociology is, but we'll only be delving into really a kind of small fraction of what's out there. This year we're using a new textbook that's quite small, but in the past we've used textbooks with like 36 chapters. We've only covered 12 of them. You could do 100 chapters and it still probably wouldn't cover everything. So what we'll be providing here is just the basic, really important foundational concepts throughout the course. And if you have interest in particular topics, whether that's the way that debt affects young people's lives, or the way that health systems affect, who gets to live and die and stuff like that. There'll be literature out there that you can gather to kind of bring into your essays and stuff like that, so you can be doing and focusing that work on stuff that you're interested in. So please keep that in mind as well. And lastly, you can get these off the lecture notes that are on the Canvas site. I've provided a bunch of links there. There's the link to my own website where I have a bunch of information about my own research, but also I post kind of current, more media and opinion-based stories that are quite sociological as they come around about the kind of things that I'm interested in. There's also a link to the textbook website, and there's links there to a couple of YouTube playlists that you can look at to get some more information and background and knowledge about some of the things we'll be looking at in the course. There's also a link there to the Newcastle Youth Studies group, which is about to be the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre. So you can check out some of the research of what me and my colleagues do. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.